She was once the queen of comedy, a woman who could make audiences roar with laughter at a time when being a black female performer meant facing walls at every turn. Moms Mabley was more than a comedian, she was a pioneer, a truth teller, and a survivor. Her voice broke barriers, her presence challenged stereotypes, and her wit carved out a space where none existed before. But if her life on stage was filled with applause and adoration, her private world was much darker, more fragile, and ultimately heartbreaking. The story of her abandoned home and the secrets it held after her death is not just about lost bricks and empty rooms. It is about a hidden life revealed too late, a life that carried both the glory of success and the sorrow of loneliness. When fans hear the name Moms Mabley, they think of the laughter, the toothless grin, and the way she fearlessly joked about race, politics, and relationships long before such topics were considered safe. They remember her appearances on television, her groundbreaking performances on stage, and her ability to say things others would never dare. But beyond the spotlight, she lived a life marked by quiet pain and the burden of surviving in an unforgiving world. Her final years, particularly the fate of her home, paint a tragic picture of how even legends can fade into silence, their memories left to crumble behind locked doors. The abandoned home tells part of that tragedy. Once a place of comfort, where laughter and music had filled the walls, it became a shell after her passing. Over the years, as time moved on and the world remembered the legend but forgot the woman, the house decayed. Windows shattered, paint peeled, weeds overtook the yard. Neighbors whispered about the home being haunted not by ghosts, but by the silence of a woman who gave so much to the world and yet died with parts of her story untold. Walking through the ruins of that house feels like stepping into the echoes of her hidden life, where the furniture sat covered in dust and personal items remained untouched, as though she had just walked out and never returned. Her private life had always been guarded. Moms Mabley was one of the first openly gay comedians in a time when being so meant risking everything. On stage, she hinted at truths through jokes, but in private, she carried the weight of a society not ready to accept her for who she truly was. Behind the laughter was a woman who had endured trauma, who had survived violence and heartbreak long before fame ever found her. The house, with its locked closets and forgotten letters, revealed fragments of those struggles. Fragments that told a story more painful than the public ever knew. It was a home filled with secrets, secrets she kept hidden because the world outside was never safe enough to hold them. The saddest part of her abandoned home is not the decay itself, but what it symbolizes. For a woman who gave everything to her craft, who built a legacy of courage and laughter, to be remembered by a crumbling house is an injustice. It shows how easily society forgets its pioneers once the spotlight fades. Her final years should have been spent surrounded by love, her legacy celebrated and preserved. Instead, her home stood as a reminder of neglect, of how even legends can slip into shadows when the world moves on. The abandoned walls told a story the stages never could, the story of a woman who fought to exist, who carried hidden pain, and whose life was far more complex than the jokes that made her famous. The first layer of Moms Mabley's story is both inspiring and heartbreaking. She was fearless on stage but vulnerable in private. She gave the world laughter but carried her own tears behind closed doors. Her abandoned home, now a relic of silence, is a symbol of how easily history buries the human side of legends. It is not just a story about a building left to rot. It is a story about a hidden life finally revealed, one that leaves us asking why those who gave so much are often given so little in return. The second layer of Moms Mabley's story dives deeper into the tragedy of her hidden life, the life she never allowed the public to fully see. On stage, she was invincible, an elderly woman with a sly grin and quick wit who could turn any taboo into a punchline. But when the curtains closed and the audience's laughter faded into silence, she returned to a world that was not nearly as kind as the one she created on stage. Fame brought her recognition, but it did not erase the pain she carried, nor did it protect her from the struggles of being a black woman and an openly gay performer in a society that often punished both. Her abandoned home, left to decay after her death, became the most haunting reflection of that truth. Behind the walls of that house were memories she rarely shared. Moms Mabley had endured some of the most unimaginable traumas in her youth, tragedies that scarred her life and shaped the person she would become. She was known for her courage, but courage often comes from surviving pain, and she had endured more than most. She buried those memories under her humor, but the cracks remained. The letters, photographs, and remnants found in her home after her death revealed glimpses of a woman who spent much of her life masking sorrow with comedy. Every dusty corner of the abandoned home seemed to whisper of the battles she fought in silence, battles that audiences never knew when they applauded her jokes. The most striking part of her private world was the isolation she lived with. While audiences assumed she was surrounded by adoring fans, colleagues, and friends, The truth was that her circle was small and carefully guarded. She had lovers, she had friends, but she also had secrets. Secrets born out of necessity in a time when being openly herself could have ended her career. Even though she was braver than most, even though she hinted at her sexuality in ways other comedians never dared, she still lived with caution. Her home was her shield, a place where she could finally be free from the expectations of the stage. And yet, that same home would eventually be abandoned, as if the world itself turned away from the woman once it no longer needed her to make it laugh. Financial struggles also left their mark. Despite her fame, Moms Mabley was not immune to exploitation. The entertainment industry in her era was ruthless, especially toward black performers. Contracts often favored promoters and managers, leaving artists with only a fraction of what they earned. For a woman who had given decades to her craft, her wealth in the later years was not nearly what it should have been. That reality adds another layer of sadness to her abandoned home. It was not just a symbol of neglect, but of the injustices of an industry that profited from her talent while giving her little protection in return. The peeling paint and broken windows were not only physical decay, they were the physical proof of how easily legends can be discarded. Even in her final years, she continued to perform, driven less by the spotlight and more by necessity. She was adored by audiences, but that adoration could not pay the bills, nor could it erase the quiet loneliness she often carried. As her health declined, she spent more time in her home, her sanctuary becoming her prison. Those who visited in her later years recalled a woman who still had sharp humor but whose body was tired, worn down by years of fighting battles both public and private. When she passed away in 1975, the house remained behind like a sealed book, holding stories no one had fully told. Over time, with no one to preserve it, it fell into abandonment, a sad mirror of how her story slipped from the front pages into forgotten history. The tragedy of Moms Mabley's hidden life lies in this contrast, adored by audiences but alone in her struggles, celebrated as a trailblazer but left without the recognition or care she truly deserved. The abandoned home stands as a cruel metaphor for this contrast. It is not just a piece of forgotten property, it is the physical representation of how society often applauds pioneers while they are alive, but allows their memory to decay once they are gone. In that decay lies the truth of Moms Mabley's final chapter, a truth more heartbreaking than any joke could hide. The third layer of Moms Mabley's heartbreaking story is not about the home itself, but about what that home reveals about the double life she lived, the public figure versus the private woman. On stage, she was bold, fearless, and unstoppable. She dared to say what others were too afraid to whisper, turning politics, race, and gender into jokes that carried hidden truths. She mocked hypocrisy, she challenged power, and she made audiences laugh while forcing them to think. In the spotlight, she looked untouchable, but the home she left behind told a much different story. It revealed the vulnerability of a woman who carried wounds from childhood, heartbreak from adulthood, and a loneliness that no amount of laughter could heal. When people peeked inside her abandoned home years after her death, they did not just see crumbling walls and forgotten furniture. They saw evidence of a life lived in fragments. Old costumes sat tucked away, reminders of the character she created, the toothless grandmother figure that became her armor on stage. Papers and letters hinted at her struggles with finances and trust, suggesting that she had been let down by people who should have protected her. The house itself felt like a time capsule, freezing her private reality at the moment of her death, as if the world had moved on and left her ghost trapped inside. Walking through it was like stepping into the silence of her hidden life, a silence that contrasted painfully with the thunder of applause she once commanded. Her private identity as a gay woman was one of the most carefully guarded truths of her era. She lived authentically in her own way, but the world was not ready to fully embrace her openness. On stage, she slipped in hints through her comedy, cloaking her truth in humor so that audiences could laugh without realizing they were hearing confessions. In her home, however, there was no need for disguise. It was the one place where she could drop the act, where she could simply exist as herself without fear of judgment. That makes the abandonment of her home even more tragic. It was the only space that held the complete version of Moms Mabley, and when it was left to rot, it felt like a piece of her true identity was being erased too. The injustice of her financial situation is another thread that ran through her hidden life. Despite decades of groundbreaking performances, her wealth was nowhere near what it should have been. The entertainment industry of her time was infamous for exploiting black performers, using their talent while denying them fair compensation and recognition. Moms Mabley was no exception. The abandoned state of her home reflected that reality. A woman who had once headlined at the Apollo Theater, who had broken barriers on television, should have had her legacy preserved in gold. Instead, her house stood as a shell, a physical reminder that the world had taken her brilliance but given her little security in return. What makes this part of her story so sad is that Moms Mabley gave people hope and joy while carrying so much pain of her own. She was a survivor of abuse. She endured the racism and sexism of her era, and she lived her truth in a world that did not want her to. Yet she never let the world see her cracks. She hid them behind her jokes, her costumes, and her stage persona. The home revealed what the stage could not: the exhaustion, the fragility, the loneliness. It showed that even the strongest figures have moments of weakness, and even the loudest voices fall silent when the applause fades. By the time her house was abandoned, her memory in popular culture had already begun to fade. Younger generations did not know her name, and her groundbreaking role in comedy was overshadowed by newer faces. That fading memory is part of the tragedy. The home, falling apart in silence, mirrored how history allowed her story to decay. The house became less of a shelter and more of a grave marker, a monument to how quickly society can forget the very pioneers who opened doors for everyone else. The third point of Moms Mabley's story makes it clear the saddest part of her abandoned home is not the broken windows or peeling paint. It is the erasure of the woman who once lived there. The house revealed the private battles of a legend, and in doing so, it reminded the world that laughter often comes from pain. Moms Mabley gave everything to her audience, but in the end, her hidden life was left exposed through the silence of her forgotten home. The fourth layer of Moms Mabley's story is perhaps the most devastating because it forces us to see the stark contrast between the legend she was and the loneliness she carried when the curtain finally fell. She had been one of the highest-paid comedians of her era, a headliner at the Apollo Theater, a woman whose jokes could pierce through hypocrisy with surgical sharpness. Yet her abandoned home stood as the cruelest metaphor. A space once filled with her laughter, her presence, and her resilience, left to rot as if history itself had forgotten her. The house became more than a building. It became a silent witness to how fleeting fame can be and how quickly the world discards those it once celebrated. Visitors who later stepped inside the ruins described an atmosphere that was heavy, as if the air itself carried sorrow. Clothes still hung in closets, papers were scattered across desks, and photographs were fading under layers of dust. The house did not feel empty. It felt frozen, as if she had simply walked away and never returned. That eerie stillness revealed something about her hidden life. She had never truly been able to separate the legend from the woman. Her public persona lived in the costumes and stage props, while her personal vulnerability lingered in the letters and keepsakes left behind.
Be jack shit and because and one of them called after she saw it because she was working with somebody else that we had worked with. And
the decaying structure mirrored the duality of her existence. Glorious in the spotlight, forgotten in the shadows. What makes this stage of her story especially tragic is that she should have been celebrated in her later years, honored with comfort and recognition. Instead, she spent much of her final life battling health issues and the financial instability that came from decades of being underpaid. Comedy had given her fame, but it had not given her wealth. She had opened doors for countless comedians who would come after her, but when it was her turn to walk through, she was left standing outside. That betrayal by the industry, reflected in the abandonment of her home, showed how little protection pioneers often receive. Her contributions were monumental, yet her final surroundings told a story of neglect. Her private pain was tied not only to her finances but to her identity. Moms Mabley was openly gay in her personal life at a time when such openness could end a career. She carried that truth courageously, often masking it in humor on stage, but in her home she lived without disguise. The house, in its abandoned state, became a symbol of that hidden authenticity. Her true self sealed away, forgotten by a world that was not ready to honor her fully. The irony is painful. The same woman who made millions laugh with jokes about love and desire was never truly allowed to live her own openly, freely, without judgment. The house preserved that secrecy even in its decay, holding on to fragments of her private world long after her voice was silenced. Her legacy as a trailblazer should have ensured that her name was etched into every history book. Yet in the years following her death, her memory faded from mainstream culture. The abandoned home embodied that fading, standing as a physical reminder of how quickly society can move on. It is not just a house falling apart. It is the erasure of a woman who carried generations on her shoulders. For those who remember, it is heartbreaking to think of the young comedians who owe their voices to her, but may never know her name. For those who don't, the decayed walls of her home whisper the reminder laughter fades, but neglect echoes longer. The fourth point in Mom Mabley's story shows us that her abandoned home is not just sad because of its condition.
I never could work with my teeth.
You're a woman after my own heart.
It is sad because of what it says about us. It reveals how we often fail to care for the legends who built the paths we now walk on. It forces us to acknowledge that behind the toothless grin and booming laughter was a woman who needed love, stability, and respect. Instead, she was left with an empty house that became her final stage. A stage where silence replaced applause, and memory crumbled alongside the walls. The fifth and final layer of Moms Mabley's story is the most haunting, because it brings everything full circle. Here was a woman who spent her entire life making others laugh, cutting through pain with humor, and using comedy as both a weapon and a shield. She became a pioneer, one of the first women to stand tall in a field dominated by men, one of the first openly gay performers to slip truth into jokes, one of the first black women to make comedy a profession rather than a side act. Yet her abandoned home, left to decay in silence, became the cruel punctuation at the end of her story. It was as if the world had accepted her laughter, but not her humanity. The walls that once carried her voice, her memories, and her struggles were left to rot, mirroring how quickly history allowed her story to fade. Her death in 1975 marked the end of an era, but it should have also marked the beginning of her legacy being celebrated. Instead, the years that followed were marked by neglect. While her influence on comedy is undeniable, her memory did not receive the constant protection it deserved. Her home became a symbol of that neglect, a place where her belongings lay untouched, her photographs collected dust, and her essence was reduced to whispers in an empty house. Every broken window and collapsing wall became a metaphor for the forgotten history of black entertainers, especially women, who paved the way but were never given the recognition or security that should have been theirs. What makes this ending so deeply sad is that Moms Mabley had given the world so much more than jokes. She had given them survival. Her comedy was not just entertainment, it was resistance. She spoke about racism, inequality, and the absurdities of power in a way that made people laugh, but also forced them to think. She did it in a time when speaking those truths was dangerous. Yet when she was gone, that courage was not preserved in the way it should have been. Her home, the one place where she could be herself, was left to be consumed by time. That neglect tells us more about society than about her. It shows how easily the voices of pioneers are silenced once they can no longer fight for themselves. But even as her home crumbled, her spirit lived on through the comedians who followed her path. From the raw honesty of Richard Pryor to the fearless wit of Whoopi Goldberg, traces of Moms Mabley's influence can be found in every comedian who dared to speak uncomfortable truths with humor. The tragedy is that many of those influenced may never have fully known how much they owed to her. The abandoned home becomes a reminder not just of her hidden life, but of the responsibility we have to remember those who opened doors before us. It demands that we look back, that we honor the pain behind the laughter, and that we preserve the stories of pioneers before they are lost to dust. The hidden life revealed through her abandoned home is a story of resilience, pain, and erasure. It shows us that behind every laugh Moms Mabley gave to the world was a personal battle she fought alone. It shows us that even legends can die in silence, their legacies left vulnerable to the erosion of time. And it shows us the heartbreaking truth that while laughter can make someone immortal in memory, it cannot protect them from being forgotten if the world does not care enough to preserve their story. Moms Mabley's abandoned home stands today as both a tragedy and a warning. It is a tragedy because it reflects how a woman who gave everything was left with so little in return. It is a warning because it reminds us that pioneers are not guaranteed protection, that we must actively fight to keep their legacies alive. The walls may have crumbled, but her voice still echoes, not in the house itself, but in the stages she once commanded, in the laughter she sparked, and in the courage she passed down. And though the home is gone, the spirit of Moms Mabley, the fearless truth teller, the survivor, the trailblazer, remains. Her story closes not with the sound of laughter echoing through a crowded theater, but with the silence of an abandoned home slowly falling into ruin. Moms Mabley gave her life to the world, carving out a place in comedy where no one believed a woman like her could stand. She broke barriers with courage, she masked her pain with humor, and she turned her wounds into jokes that still ring with truth. Yet in the end, the very house that once sheltered her dreams and her secrets was left behind, forgotten just as history nearly forgot her.
It ain't coming. So he looked out, he said, I don't see nothing but a dog. So the man backed out just as he hit the brick, bam!
The tragedy of her abandoned home is not just about bricks and wood. It is about memory, about how easily pioneers can be erased once the applause fades. But even as her home decayed, her spirit never did. Her voice lives on in every comedian who dares to be bold, in every joke that challenges power, in every laugh that hides a deeper truth. The moms who once made the world laugh may have been left with a silent house, but her legacy refuses silence. It reminds us that legends are human, that they carry pain behind the punchlines, and that if we do not protect their memory, we risk losing more than just their stories. We risk losing the truth they fought so hard to tell.